we've spent a lot of time talking yesterday. This is the best prepared. This is the best prepared panel. But today we wanted to invite you. We don't have a thesis here. We don't have a thesis here. It's just tapping into Ron's experience, especially when it comes to covering all the events here in Bosnia at the beginning of 90s, trying to, at the same time when we have the Russian invasion ongoing in Ukraine, from last year, we see how different moments of that war are being memorized, how they're being portrayed, and as such, how they shape us, how they shape different societies. So we want to do, well, maybe not like this, but I'm going to stop here just to say hi, Ron.
Hello.
I'm sorry, I stole a lot of your show, but...
You ruined everything. We have like 5 minutes left. It's like, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I can tell you, yesterday we took a long drive among Bosnia, and Ron was all the time, please find a highway. And every time he said it, we ended up on a even smaller mountainous road. So, but we got to see a lot of interesting places anyhow. Can you tell us a little bit how you found yourself there and how did you follow those events?
This is the, what some people refer to as the insurrection at the US Capitol in Washington, DC. This is one of the more famous protester characters known as the shaman entering into the Capitol building. And it was an event that has really still is resonating in America as America tries to decide what kind of country they are. There was this idea that many Americans have had since its inception about this idea of American exceptionalism, which is almost to the point of like, we're better than everybody else and we can tell people how to run a democracy, how to have an election, how to do all of these different things. And over the years, as America made more and more mistakes, these things kind of broke apart. And I think that this final insurrection, this riot at the Capitol has finally should have made Americans aware that what happens in America has happened around the world. We are like everybody else, and we need to improve our situation. I have photographed similar situations in Moscow, in Central America, in Africa, of government buildings being ransacked and destroyed and taken over by protesters for various reasons. And this is now just another place. And going back to this original thing that Jakub was talking about impact, the reason that we as photographers go to these places is to be able to give you information about your own world, the world around you, what's happening, your place in it, so you can make better decisions, whether it's voting differently in places where you can have an impact with your vote, donating money, protesting, understanding, teaching your children. I think that the photography that I've done, especially the photography that I've done here in Bosnia and Croatia and Kosovo, is part of an education system. It is something for people to react to when it immediately comes out, but so often there is no reaction. The photographs then become tools to instruct, to remind, and to hold people responsible, not only for their action, but for their inaction.
And this event, we also brought it up specifically because, first of all, it's a very recent one. And because it's a recent one, it's not that there was only just media or a couple photographers taking photos. There were, actually, frankly speaking, there was almost all the civilians, whether they were like participating in it, they were doing a lot of visuals, whether it was throwing photos on Instagram to social media, TikToks, and so on. So this original reporting done by professional photographers is just one thing. But on the other hand, then this event was covered from so many angles. And I think Ron told me that when you later on looked at different visual, you were like, where the hell did that happen? You know, I wasn't part of this stream. And there were also a lot of investigations done immediately, trying to reconstruct the whole space. What's your take on it? You know, when you were starting, you had the monopoly, kinda like you and some other photographers, you had the monopoly of, and I mean it in a good way, but you had the monopoly, you know, of being the first on site, witnessing those things and then showing them to the world. Like, how do you feel right now when there's me and there's everybody here also taking, I hope, a lot of photos, tagging us on Instagram right now? So,
Well, first, it's fantastic. I think we live in a world now where everybody is a photographer, has the capacity to be a photographer, and can document the way that they see the world, which is fantastic. But it doesn't mean that everybody is a photojournalist, that everybody is approaching the way that they look at the world in the same way that people like myself, those at Seven, or the people that we train at the Seven Foundation, to look at the world through rules of journalism, through integrity, through being truthful and representing the situation in the correct way with captions and so on. There's a whole other group of things, and authorship and so on. But I do think that the combination of work by people like myself and citizen journalism allows us to see things that we were never able to see before. I think January 6th is a good example, but the better example is Ukraine. This is going to be the most documented conflict ever. You have people like myself, but you have now footage from military drones, journalist drones, from cameras on the street, from bank machines, from soldiers, from civilians. So the ability to put everything together to what has happened has never happened before. When you look at the war crimes that occurred here, it was very difficult for the investigators to come back and interview and try to be able to build cases to go to The Hague. Now in Ukraine, I was with the war crimes prosecutors. We arrive in Bucha. We find the victims on the street. Witnesses come up. They start to identify, give information. These are the Russian officers. Here's their Facebook page. Here's their Instagram feed. Here's the list of their all the troops in their unit. So much more information exists now that is really only to the benefit of the world process of trying to hold people accountable for what's going on. It's a dramatic difference between what occurred here in the 90s and what's now occurring in Ukraine more than 30 years later.
there was a great, for example, visual investigation done by Bellingcat when they identified all those Russian soldiers responsible for targeting missiles. And they basically built up their profiles showing them having holidays, just they went, first of all, identified them, who they are, and then they found their social media profiles. And, it's also, I would say, a little bit mindfucking in a way, because you would expect, I think, some evil people in some bunker, targeting those missiles, and then you are contrasted with how they, from 8 to 4, we target missiles, and then we go have fun, which actually makes it, I think, even more evil in a way when you think, when I think about it, in my head. Can you tell us a little bit about this photo? Does anyone actually have seen this photography before? Okay, because I know that I'm not from here. I'm from Poland, so I know that for some of you who lived through those events, a lot of those photographies can bring up a lot of memories, and they tap into also your history. But when we were thinking, also trying to think about those, because we selected 4 moments, how certain moments become or not become symbols later on. Because if you think about it, very important historical events, especially, let's say, since, 50s or 60s, we associate them with certain visual. When we tap into, there is 1 photo or there is 2 photos, and then something happens major. And we'll go back to this, but I think in 2015, there was a photograph of the little dead boy on one of the beaches, and that basically changed
the conversation.
Changed the conversation, just this 1 photo. So can you tell us a little bit more about it?
This is a photograph. This is the Parliament building. You guys probably recognize the black stone. This is on April 6th during the Peace March, April 6, 1992, when they opened fire from the Holiday Inn and elsewhere on the people that were trying to, one last-ditch effort to keep Bosnia as, the theme of Yugoslavia was their last attempt. So this was sort of what's now recognized as kind of the official beginning of the conflict here. in your country. And it's another moment from across the street as everybody was ducking from gunfire. Just a small aside, one of the things that as dramatic as the photograph is also incredibly, for me, a very Bosnian photograph, is to see the guy on the right making sure he gets that last smoke right before the bullets are flying. But no matter what, I've got to smoke. It was very represented the fear and also just what you guys lived through and your parents lived through, the desire to have as much of a normal life as possible during the siege, which was the strength of the Bosnian people that was so important for the world to see, to eventually be able to come and, even though it took so long, to come and help end this war.
Well, I have to say also that the true reason why we also partner with Point is because this is the last conference around the world when you can actually enjoy a cigarette and be at the event. So I know that there is a law trying to be changed, but thanks to the Bosnian political system, it's going to take at least a decade before it is in power. Last year, I had Dalio here gave me a half an hour introduction to the Bosnian political system. So it's been a wonderful experience. I still don't get it, but at least I know where to listen to it. Have you ever thought about because one thing is the photography itself, when you think as an artist, what do you want to capture, how do you want to capture, and so on. But what does it take for a certain photo, then later on to become symbol? What other things around it have to be, I don't know, happen for it to be this one?
Well, with journalism, its context obviously is incredibly important. The event, what it represents, what it means, and that often can change over time, where people don't really understand in the beginning what's happening, and as the world unfolds, the photograph can try to take on new meaning. And for photographs such as this in the 90s, the idea of going viral is very different than going viral today. It's much more difficult for photography to be seen over and over again due to just simply technology. And so photographs that over the years, especially from the 50s through today, or from the 50s through the advent of digital photography in the beginning of the 2000s, the pictures that live on, that you continue to see, have this resonance, that the audience has reacted to it, the context, the photographic aesthetics, all combined mean something, represent something, and are something to be remembered. So for those of you that might know this photograph was taken a few days before April 6th is April 2nd in a town called Bijeljina on the border with Serbia. This man's name is, which I found out just in the last 10 years or so, this man is Harush Zabiri. He is a Macedonian Albanian working in a bakery to support his family, 25 years old. And he is, in reality, probably the first prisoner of the war in Bosnia. Here, he's being taken by a Serbian paramilitary group known as the Tigers, led by a warlord known as Arkan. And unfortunately, Harush here is essentially asking me to help him, and there's little that I could do, but at least document the fact that he was taken, and that I hope that would be enough to put pressure on the soldiers. A few hours later, Harush was brought into a building for interrogation. He either jumped or was thrown out of a window. He survived the fall, amazingly enough. He was dragged back into the building and never seen again until 2004 or so, when his remains were identified through DNA and brought back to be buried with his family. And it's kind of one of the interesting things about the power of photography and what it meant. So I went to meet his family, thinking that they would be incredibly upset with me for not saving their son. And when I met them, they came out with probably every photograph that had been published, every magazine around the world, and they said, obviously, that they would rather have Harush with them, but felt that his death was not in vain because it showed the world what was happening here. And for some reason, they actually thanked me for doing this, which I thought was, well, I don't know if I would do the same thing, but I was overwhelmed by the interaction with Harush's family.
I actually find it fascinating that you, take interest in your photos in a way, so you just don't take a photo and then send it, but you actually try to understand more about the people, or actually I don't know, I think when I imagine this process, it's more like a movie, and you took, one piece of it, and then you try to understand what happened before and then what happened after it. How did that happen? Why did you start to do it?
There are times when you have the ability to do this. This photograph became very well known and was, even till today, published at least once a month somewhere. It's become one of the symbols not of just the war in Bosnia, but of war crimes itself. It's gone beyond what it was originally intended to be. And so when you have like this photograph and the next photograph, we can go to the next one, very similar, where it's part of a discussion that's outside of me. It has a life of its own. So here, it's a photograph of Arkan's tigers with, there's a married couple, Abdurrahman and Hamieta Pajeti, also from Macedonia. And in the middle is Ashia Tifa Shabanovic from Bielina. So as this photograph became more and more well-known, more and more research, more and more understanding about what it represented and what had happened, there's no other way but to get involved to understand what's going on in this photograph. Several weeks ago, in one of the last trials, war crime trials from here, 2 Serbian ministers were convicted, their conviction was reaffirmed in the appeals court, and this photograph, which has been used in other trials like Karadzic and others, but here played a very big role in ensuring their guilt. And it was tied into the guy in the middle, who many of you might know, who's been allegedly identified as Srđan Golubovic, who's a DJ in Belgrade. And one of the things that's happening even today, now more than 30 years after this picture has been taken, the daughter of Asya Shabanovic, Alma Pekovic, whose house is behind this wall, has taken this photograph to the Serbian War Crimes Tribunal because The Hague is no longer functioning, and is trying to indict these 3 soldiers of war crimes based solely on this photograph.
So how do you feel right now in this ecosystem when there is, well, first of all, here you had a different access to actually witnessing this. So where do you see the distinction, or maybe you don't see a distinction between this documenting in case of, so it would be more into documenting war crimes and being more of a journalist?
Well, I think it's natural. It's part of the process. We are there to document. We're there to show what's happening. You're there to spend time, whether it's with the unit or with civilians, whether it was in Bielina or in Bucha or Irpin in Ukraine, to ensure that people know what's going on. Especially today, when there is now, last year, over 1 trillion photographs were taken by all of us. Most of them of cats and your lunch. But other photographs of your lives, your families, and things that are going on in the world that people need to know about. But we are trying all the time as photographers to have our work rise above all the other noise for it to have this idea of impact. And the impact comes through you. If you as the audience don't pay attention and don't care, or don't believe the photographs that you're seeing, then there's no point. But the previous photograph and this photograph taken in the previous one in Manjača, this one in Ternopili, these photographs continue to have impact, and they're of real people. So the guy with his back to us on the right, I finally tracked him down. He survived Ternopily, managed to eventually become a refugee and move to New Zealand, and has a family and so on. And we reconnected a couple of years ago on a Seven Foundation project called Imagine, Reflections on Peace. And he spoke about, from his side, remembering how I showed up with my camera, and they're like, what is this guy doing here with the camera, and what will happen to us, and is it good that people know that we are here and what's happening to us, and so on. And so it was this very unusual experience to hear from his side the experience of being photographed, as well as, of course, being a prisoner.
Just to close up, what was the first thing for you? Is to become a photographer or more of a journalist, or combined?
No, I think it's a combination. I mean, I'm not an art photographer, I'm not a portrait photographer, I'm a photojournalist. And my idea is always to go out there, to document, show people what's going on, for there to be a reaction immediately. But as I said before, the pictures often fail. Here, these are the women, survivors of Srebrenica, who had just arrived in Tuzla. And when I arrived to this group, everybody was in shock, everybody was silent. And I just asked a simple question, where are the men? Because we didn't understand at that point what was happening. And everybody started to cry. And it was just an overwhelming experience, because many of them already knew that their husbands, their fathers, their sons, their brothers were killed, or the others that didn't were waiting, hoping for good news. Very few received that good news.
Yesterday we actually went together to Srebrenica, and what I found simple but also intriguing how you describe the process of learning about the events there. Because right now, when something major happens, we are overloaded with content usually, and then out of these different stories, part of them true, or like not stories, but part of the, pieces of information. Part of them are true, part of them are fake, part of them is just some, chaos basically being transmitted. Then we jump in, fact checkers, trying to make a sense out of it. Whereas for you, it was different back then. This is just some kind of information. You went there, and then you and other journalists started to understand what happened, and then you broke it.
But it's not so different than today, because let's use Bucha, let's use Irpin as examples. We didn't know what was happening. When we arrived in Bucha and there were executed people on the streets and so on, this was discovering it as we discovered it. The world discovered it through the journalists and through the stories of the survivors. So there are unfortunately, many times where things are happening in a black hole. And there are other times when you have amazing journalism being done using Mariupol as an example in Ukraine, where an AP team, photographer and videographer, stayed under incredible risks to document what was going on. And the work that was coming out, if you remember, of the pregnant woman on the stretcher where the Russians said this was fake, using the same playbook as you heard here with the market massacre, they're not real people that are killed and so on. In some ways, things have not changed at all. In other ways, things have changed dramatically. And then just jumping back just for this particular photograph to this idea of being connected to the subject. This woman is Nevia Halilovic, survived Srebrenica, but her husband and son were killed, and here she is outcrying against the Dutch soldier in anger about what had happened. When Ratko Mladic was at The Hague, and the day of his sentencing, whether he was going to be guilty or not, I was with her again in Potocari, watching with her and other mothers of Srebrenica for this justice that they had been waiting for. And as the verdict was read of guilty, almost a duplicate pose, she looked exactly the same, her arms were outstretched as she cried, a mix of relief, happiness, and of course, continued sadness for what had happened. And my goal as a photographer is to create these images that will remain representative of situations, and the hope that you will remember them, your children will study them in school, and of course the hope is mostly that we learn from them and don't repeat the same mistakes that we made and that our parents made in the past.